A lone figure waits on platform 7, but is he victim or villain? Welcome to Crimson Whisper. I am your host, Bramwell. Tell me where you're listening from. I cherish every comment. Now let's uncover the truth. It was upon a raw and fog-laden evening in the late autumn of 1893 that Holmes and I found ourselves once more summoned into a perplexing affair, the like of which had confounded both Scotland Yard and the railway authorities. London's smog, thick as muslin, hung about Baker Street, muffling the glow of gas lamps and turning every hansom cab into a shapeless blur. I had returned early from my rounds and was contentedly perusing a medical journal, when our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, bustled in with a telegram addressed to my companion. Holmes slit the envelope with his usual swift precision, and his eyes, keen and grey, darted across the brief message. His brows lifted slightly, though the rest of his face remained impassive. "Come, Watson," he said, tossing the paper into my lap. "It appears we are wanted at Charing Cross Station, a matter both delicate and singular." The telegram was signed by Inspector Lestrade, who, though often inclined to disparage Holmes's methods, had of late learned the wisdom of calling upon him when difficulties grew insurmountable. Within half an hour we were seated in a cab, rattling through the gaslit streets toward the bustling terminus. I could not forbear pressing my friend for some hint as to the nature of the case. Lestrade's wording was curiously sparse, I observed. A stranger on platform 7. What could he mean by that? Surely some accident or a gentleman fallen in a faint. Holmes gave a dry laugh. "My dear fellow, when Lestrade pronounces a matter singular, it is rarely as mundane as a fainting fit. You may depend upon it, the problem will possess some quality outside the common run." Charing Cross, when we arrived, was a scene of restless confusion. The great iron arches echoed with the whistle of engines and the hurrying footsteps of travellers. Porters wheeled barrows stacked high with trunks, while newsboys darted among the throng crying the latest evening editions. Yet on platform 7 there hung an atmosphere wholly different from the ordinary bustle of travel. A knot of constables kept back a curious crowd, and at the centre, standing rigid as a chess piece set upon a board, was Inspector Lestrade himself. "Ah, Mr. Holmes." "Doctor," said he, greeting us with a mixture of relief and irritation. "I had hoped you would come at once. It is the queerest business I've encountered in years." He led us through the cordon of officers, and there, seated upright upon a wooden bench beneath the great station clock, was a man whose presence struck me with an odd unease. He was immaculately dressed in a dark frock coat, his gloved hands resting neatly upon his knees. His hat was set upon the seat beside him, yet his head lolled slightly to one side, and upon closer view I perceived that his eyes, half open, were fixed with a glassy stare upon nothing at all. The man was dead. Discovered. "Not an hour ago," said Lestrade in a low voice. "No luggage, no ticket, no papers. None of the porters recall seeing him arrive. He seems to have taken his seat, and there he sits still, stone dead. The physicians tell me he cannot have been dead more than 2 hours. And yet, Mr. Holmes, observe, there is not a mark upon him." Holmes bent forward with the eager gleam of the hunter sighting his quarry. He examined the body with swift yet delicate motions of his long fingers, pausing once or twice to peer more closely at the man's cuffs, the lining of his coat, and the curious position of his boots. A faint smile, sardonic and secretive, played upon his lips. "Watson," said he, straightening, "it seems we are indeed confronted with something far removed from the commonplace. A stranger who arrives from nowhere, dies silently in a crowded station, and leaves behind neither name nor trace. There is, I think, more drama in this lifeless figure than in a dozen murders of the most bloody description." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You believe, then, that foul play is involved?" Holmes's eyes glittered in the dim light of the station. "Lamps." "My dear Inspector," said he softly, "to declare that would be premature. But I venture to predict that by the time we have unravelled the story of the stranger on platform 7, we shall find ourselves in the midst of one of the most curious enigmas London has yet offered us." Holmes lingered before the body a while, longer, his eyes tracing over every detail with the meticulous attention of a man deciphering a cipher. He stooped once more to lift the stranger's hand, turning it so that the gaslight glinted faintly off the cuff button. Then, with a soft grunt, he replaced it, drew his coat about him, and gestured for me to follow. Lestrade, ever anxious to glean a hint of my companion's thoughts, hurried beside him. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he asked in a tone of impatience thinly veiled as curiosity, "what do you make of it? Poison? Heart failure?" The surgeon was clear enough that no wound can be found. Holmes's lips twitched into what might have been amusement. "The surgeon was correct, Inspector, but his conclusion is premature. The absence of visible injury is not the absence of cause. There are at least 3 avenues by which a man might be dispatched, leaving not a trace upon his body. 2 of them are exceedingly rare. The third is almost common if one knows where to look." Lestrade frowned. "And which is it here?" That is precisely what we must determine." Holmes's eyes swept once more about the platform, the soot-smeared ironwork above, the shifting crowd at the cordon, the porters whispering in awe. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second upon a scuff mark on the stone near the bench, before he turned sharply upon his heel. "Come, Watson, there is little more to be gained here. Inspector, have the body conveyed to the mortuary, but leave his clothing and effects untouched. The smallest alteration may obscure a most vital clue." We left the station in silence. Holmes sunk deep in contemplation, his long fingers tapping upon the cane he carried. I knew better than to intrude upon his thoughts at such moments, but I could not wholly contain my own curiosity. "What struck you most forcibly, Holmes?" I asked at last, as our cab clattered over the wet cobblestones toward Baker Street. He did not answer at once, but stared instead through the cab's misted window at the blur of lamplight and shadow passing by. When he spoke, it was almost to himself. "A man dies in a public place, without a struggle, without a cry. His attire is of quality, his manner of grooming exact. Yet no one saw him arrive, no papers, no luggage, no watch chain, nor pocketbook. A gentleman who leaves the world as anonymously as he entered the station. That, Watson, is the puzzle. Death is seldom so neat unless carefully arranged." I shivered at his words. "Then you incline toward foul play?" "I incline toward order," Holmes replied sharply. "Nature permits accident, but accident seldom arranges its stage with such precision." It was near 10 o'clock when we reached Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, with her customary forethought, had laid a light supper. Holmes, however, waved it aside and took immediately to his armchair, stretching his long legs to the fire. He reached for his Persian slipper, drew out his pipe, and soon the air was thick with the blue spirals of his strong tobacco. I set myself opposite him, notebook at the ready, for I knew from experience that his mind was at its clearest when wrapped in smoke. "You saw his clothing, Watson," he began abruptly. "Yes, dark frock coat, neat gloves, boots in excellent condition. And yet the right boot was faintly scuffed at the toe, while the left was polished to a mirror. What? Inference. That he stumbled, perhaps. Good, Watson, excellent, but why only the right? The scuff was not from ordinary wear, it was fresh, acquired within the hour. A stumble, yes, but one occasioned not by uneven ground, but by a sudden weakness in the limb. The man faltered as he sat. And note, too, the faintest odor. Did you not catch it? No. A trace only, but unmistakable to a trained nose. Bitter almonds, Watson. Bitter almonds. "Poison," I exclaimed. Holmes inclined his head. "Prussic acid or something akin. It acts swiftly, almost silently, but whether he swallowed it willingly or whether it was administered by another hand remains to be seen." He puffed at his pipe, eyes half closed, as if following some intricate pattern in the smoke. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping. But there was another matter. His cuff button, brass, plain, yet affixed by a thread not of his own. Garment, but of a different cloth entirely. Someone, Watson, has been tampering with his attire. This revelation startled me. But why, Holmes? Why indeed? A man dies quietly in a station, and another, before or after his death, adjusts his clothing. To conceal what? A message, perhaps. A token. We cannot know until we have the garments under our lens. There was a rap upon the door, and Lestrade was shown in. He looked harried, his bowler hat askew. "The body's been taken as you asked, Mr. Holmes, but there's a matter I thought you should know. One of the porters has come forward, says he saw a tall fellow in a grey coat speaking with the dead man not an hour before the discovery. Couldn't hear their words over the trains, but he swears the stranger pressed something into the gentleman's hand before walking briskly away." Holmes's eyes flashed. "A most valuable observation. Did the porter describe the stranger?" "Only that he was clean-shaven, carried a black umbrella, and walked with a slight stoop." Holmes rose, pacing the room in agitation. "So, Watson, our faceless corpse begins to take shape through the shadow it casts. A gift pressed into his hand, an object now missing, and we have a phantom benefactor vanishing into the crowd. The question is whether that gift bore friendship or death." He stopped short, striking his palm with sudden energy. "We must see the body at once, Watson. There is no time to lose. By tomorrow, if my suspicions prove correct, the trail will have cooled, and our stranger on platform 7 will be no more than another puzzle swept into the dust of the city." I seized my hat and coat without hesitation, for though I did not yet perceive the direction of his reasoning, the gleam in Holmes's eye told me we stood at the threshold of one of those tangled mysteries that only his singular genius could unpick. And as the cab bore us once more into the night, I could not help but feel the heavy hand of some unseen design tightening about us, a design woven with a skill equal, perhaps, even to Sherlock Holmes himself. The night air was sharp as we descended from the cab and crossed the quiet courtyard leading to the mortuary. A watchman, lantern in hand, admitted us with a nod, and the chill of the stone passageway seemed to echo the solemnity of the errand. Holmes walked swiftly, his face composed, his manner bristling with that peculiar intensity I had often observed when he scented the faintest trail of truth. Lestrade trailed behind us, clearly fatigued yet unwilling to leave the matter unattended, his stout figure casting long shadows upon the walls. In the small chamber, lit by a single oil lamp, the stranger on platform 7 lay stretched upon the table, as motionless as when first I beheld him. The mortuary surgeon had refrained from interference, respecting Holmes's instruction, so that the body was as untouched as it had been on the station bench. Holmes immediately drew off his gloves and bent to his work with a reverence one might have thought reserved for some rare specimen in a museum. "Observe, Watson," he said as he drew the lamp closer. "The nails, neatly trimmed, yet with a faint discoloration beneath the cuticles. Note, too, the faint bluish tinge of the lips. These are the silent witnesses that speak when all else is mute." I peered as directed. "Cyanosis," I suggested. "Precisely. Such symptoms are consistent with prussic acid, as I suspected, but let us proceed cautiously." He produced his magnifying lens and leaned over the man's wrists, the sharp gleam of his eyes missing nothing. "Here, a faint abrasion, scarcely more than a scratch upon the left wrist. What do you make of it, Watson?" I examined it carefully. "Could be nothing more than a scrape against a rough surface." Holmes shook his head. "No, the edges are too neat, too deliberate. A puncture of some sort, yet not deep. The sort one might expect from the clasp of a bracelet or the sharp edge of a metallic object worn upon the arm. Now why should a well-dressed gentleman bear such a mark?" He shifted suddenly to the cuff. With a swift motion he unfastened it and spread the sleeve open upon the table. A tiny thread of coarse grey wool protruded from the buttonhole. Holmes seized it eagerly with his tweezers and held it up for us to see. "Ah, and here lies our intruder's signature. This thread does not belong to the man's own clothing, which is of fine black broadcloth. It comes from another garment entirely, coarse, serviceable, and unmistakably foreign. Our visitor with the grey coat, Watson, has left his calling card upon his victim's sleeve." Lestrade let out a grunt of surprise. "By George, Mr. Holmes, that's devilish clever. So the fellow in the grey coat must have handled him." Holmes inclined his head. "Handled him, yes, and quite recently. Whether to assist, to search, or to do far worse, remains our business to discover. But let us see whether he left us any further testimony." His hands moved lightly across the waistcoat, probing the seams with deft precision. From one pocket, he drew a folded scrap of paper, damp with perspiration. With delicate fingers he opened it and revealed a slip torn from some larger sheet. Upon it was scrawled, in hurried pencil, but 3 words: midnight, 7 bells. The words seemed to hang in the air with ominous weight. Lestrade frowned deeply, muttering, 7 bells. Some tavern, no doubt. I know half a dozen by that name from the docks to Stepney. Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector. If it were merely an alehouse, the name would be specified in full. Here it is written as a signal, a rendezvous. 7 bells is no tavern but a phrase, sailors' slang for the half-hour before midnight. Our man had an appointment at sea-time reckoning, and the rendezvous was to be kept tonight. I could not conceal my astonishment. Then he was not merely a traveller by chance? Certainly not, Watson. He came to Charing Cross with purpose, and that purpose has been interrupted, fatally. Holmes's expression grew grim as he replaced the slip within an envelope of his own. This note confirms what I suspected. Our dead stranger was drawn into a clandestine meeting. Whether as victim, conspirator, or messenger, we shall know soon enough. Lestrade rubbed his hands together, half eager, half doubtful. If you're right, Mr. Holmes, then we've but a couple of hours before the meeting time. Shall we set? Men to watch every 7 bells in the city? Holmes smiled faintly, almost pityingly. My dear Inspector, 1,000 men so employed would bring us no nearer. But 1 man, with eyes open and reason sharpened, may be sufficient. Midnight. Platform. 7 Charing Cross, that is our theatre, and if I err the curtain will fall harmlessly. But if I am right, he broke off, his gaze distant, the lamplight carving his sharp features into planes of shadow. We quitted the mortuary shortly thereafter, and the cold wind seemed almost bracing after the stifling atmosphere of the chamber. Holmes was silent. As we returned to Baker Street, his mind clearly engaged upon some intricate calculation. I ventured no question, for I knew that to disturb his thoughts at such a time was to risk breaking the fragile thread of insight that connected clue to conclusion. Back in our sitting room, he went at once to the chemical table, where he performed a brief series of tests upon the woolen thread. I watched him with curiosity as he compared its fibers under the lens. Foreign indeed, he murmured at last. Dyed with an agent rarely used in England, but common enough in the Baltic trade. Riga, perhaps, or Königsberg. Our grey-coated stranger is not an Englishman, or at least not attired by English hands. Another piece upon the board, Watson. Another step in the dance. The clock upon the mantelpiece struck 11, and Holmes sprang suddenly to his feet. Come, Watson. There is no time for further speculation. If we are to prevent a second tragedy, we must be present when the 7 bells toll. Lestrade looked up in surprise. You mean to keep the appointment? Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which I knew heralded the climax of his reasoning. Precisely, Inspector. The man who sent that note expects to meet his correspondent at midnight. He shall meet someone, but it will not be the victim he anticipated. By then perhaps the mask will fall, and we shall glimpse the hand that guided this silent drama. And so, with little more than an hour before the appointed time, we set forth once again into the fog-draped city, bound for platform 7, where the stillness of death had earlier presided, and where now the promise of revelation loomed like a shadow waiting to take form. The fog hung thick and low as our cab rattled through the streets once more, muffling the glow of the gas lamps, so that each appeared as a wavering halo suspended in the mist. Holmes sat bolt upright, his eyes fixed ahead, his thin fingers drumming soundlessly against the handle of his cane. Lestrade muttered now and again about the lateness of the hour and the folly of chasing shadows, but my companion paid him no heed. I had long since learned that such silence was the crucible in which Holmes' deductions were forged, and I preserved it with equal vigilance. When at last we alighted at Charing Cross, the great station loomed over us like some colossal cavern, its iron ribs glistening with damp. Midnight was not far off. The trains had grown fewer, and the once teeming concourse now held only a scatter of late travellers hurrying to their destinations. Yet platform 7 lay eerily quiet, the echoes of our footsteps carrying farther than seemed natural. The bench, where the dead man had been discovered, stood empty beneath the clock, its polished surface a silent witness to the grim scene we had left hours before. Holmes motioned us into the deeper shadow of a luggage cart that stood against the wall. From this vantage, we commanded a clear view of the bench and the approaches without exposing ourselves to scrutiny. He crouched low, his sharp profile distinct against the lamplight, while Lestrade shuffled uneasily at his side. "Remember," Holmes whispered, "we are not here to intervene at the first sign of contact. Let the play unfold, for only in its proper sequence will the plot declare itself. When I give the word then, and only then, you may act." The minutes crept by with a slowness that weighed upon the nerves. The station clock ticked inexorably. Toward midnight, each stroke reverberating through the empty space like the tolling of a bell. My own heart seemed to keep time with it, so heightened was my anticipation. At precisely 11:45, a solitary figure appeared at the far end of the platform. He was tall, his shoulders stooped, his step deliberate yet swift. A grey coat hung about him, and in his hand he bore a black umbrella. He glanced once over his shoulder before proceeding down the platform with the caution of one who expects pursuit. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Our friend of the coarse wool," he breathed scarce above a whisper. The man approached the bench, hesitated, and then seated himself upon it, arranging his coat about him with a deliberate composure. He produced a watch from his pocket, consulted it, and then settled into a posture of patient expectation. His face, partly illuminated by the overhead lamp, was narrow and pale, with a jawline too sharp for comfort. He had the look of one accustomed to concealment. The station around us lay hushed, save for the distant rumble of a departing train. No other traveller passed along platform 7. At the stroke of midnight, the man stirred, his eyes flicking toward the entrance. Another figure, smaller and more furtive, emerged from the mist. This newcomer wore a shabby cloak, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and he walked with quick, nervous steps. The two men greeted one another without word or gesture, a familiarity, save for a swift exchange of glances. Then the smaller man drew something from his pocket, an envelope thick with contents, and slid it across the bench. The tall man in grey received it with a movement so swift it was nearly imperceptible. For a moment, both sat still. The silence, broken only by the faint creak of iron girders above. Holmes' hand touched my arm lightly. "Mark well, Watson. The crux approaches." Even as he spoke, the man in grey reached inside his coat and produced what seemed at first a folded newspaper. But as he shifted it toward the other, the lamp revealed the gleam of something harder, a case of metal, compact and curious in design. The smaller man recoiled slightly, then leaned in as though to study it more closely. It was in that instant that Holmes rose from the shadows, his long figure unfolding like a whipcord. His voice rang clear and commanding through the empty platform. "That will suffice, gentlemen. Scotland Yard has a keen interest in your midnight commerce." Both men started violently. The smaller bolted upright, his hand darting toward the envelope, but Lestrade and I were already upon him, seizing his arms before he could flee. The tall man in grey, however, proved swifter. With a sudden movement, he flung the metal case behind him toward the tracks, and before Holmes could intercept him, he had dashed toward the stairwell with astonishing speed. "After him, Watson!" Holmes cried, his cloak flying as he sprang forward. The chase that followed was swift and perilous. The grey-coated figure darted through the deserted station, weaving among luggage trolleys and leaping low barriers with an agility that belied his stooped frame. Holmes pursued with relentless determination, his stride devouring the distance between them. I followed as best I could, my lungs burning with the effort, Lestrade panting behind. The fugitive burst through a side door into the open air, where the fog hung even thicker. He turned sharply down an alley that ran beside the station wall. Holmes was upon him in an instant, grasping at the man's shoulder. But the fellow twisted free with desperate strength. The two figures grappled in the mist, their forms half lost to view, until Holmes's hand found purchase upon the coat collar. There came a sound of tearing cloth, and the grey figure wrenched himself free, vanishing into the fog with a cry that echoed faintly down the alleyway. Holmes staggered back, the torn fragment of coarse wool clutched in his hand. "Confound it," he muttered between clenched teeth. "The man is as slippery as an eel." but he has left us one more piece of himself, Watson, and that may prove his undoing. By the time we returned to platform 7, Lestrade had secured the smaller man, who sat sullen and silent upon the bench, his eyes fixed upon the ground. The envelope lay upon the inspector's lap, its seal unbroken. The metal case had been retrieved from the tracks, dented but intact. Holmes examined both with quiet satisfaction before slipping them into his pocket. "The night has yielded more than I dared hope," he said, his voice once more calm and assured. "We have a prisoner, a clue, and an adversary who will not easily forget the hand that sought to grasp him. The game is well begun, Watson, and before long I trust we shall know what enterprise has already claimed one life, and threatens perhaps many more." His words, spoken amid the swirling fog and the distant toll of a bell, seemed to seal the beginning of some deeper and more perilous mystery, one that even then I sensed would test Holmes's powers to their utmost. The prisoner we had secured was a small, wiry fellow with narrow eyes and a complexion that spoke of long nights and rough living. He sat with arms bound, refusing to meet our gaze, his lips pressed tight in the manner of one who has resolved to betray nothing. Lestrade, flushed with the triumph of an arrest, paced back and forth before him, puffing with impatience. "Now, then," the inspector said, stopping abruptly. "Your name, my man. Out with it and no lies. You've been caught in the very act of unlawful exchange, and I'll not be trifled with." The fellow gave no answer. He sat staring at the floor, his jaw set, his eyes flickering only once briefly toward Holmes, who stood some distance off, calmly examining the torn fragment of wool he had secured from the fugitive's coat. Holmes paid him no more attention than if he were a specimen pinned to a board, his fingers lightly brushing the fabric, his lips moving soundlessly as if in some silent calculation. "Stubborn as a mule," Lestrade muttered, turning to Holmes. "What's to be done with him? The jailers can shake a name out of him well enough." Holmes looked up with a faint smile. "No doubt, Inspector, but shaking is a crude tool. Our friend here will speak, but not to questions shouted at him. He will speak to the logic that makes his silence futile." He crossed the platform and seated himself upon the bench opposite the prisoner, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "You are caught between two fires, my good fellow," Holmes began conversationally. "On one side the law, which sees you with an envelope of incriminating contents passed under circumstances already suspicious. On the other side, but you know it well, the man in grey. He escaped us tonight, but he will not forgive you for losing him his prize. Silence is no protection. Speak, and you may yet walk free with the law as your shield. Say nothing, and you will serve neither master nor judge, but only the gallows." At these words the man's jaw twitched, though he still said nothing. Holmes, observing this, leaned back, his tone sharpening. "The dead man on this very bench was he too bound by silence, or did he trust the grey-coated gentleman one step too far? Answer me that, and perhaps your life will not follow the same pattern." The prisoner's eyes darted up at last, startled and wary. He swallowed, then muttered in a low, grudging voice, "I don't know who killed him." Lestrade's brows shot up. "So you admit knowledge of him, then?" The fellow shrugged, his gaze sliding back toward the ground. "I was told to bring the packet, that's all. A meeting, that's all. I never laid eyes on the man before tonight." Holmes inclined his head. "Progress, Watson. You see how the lock yields with the gentlest of keys. Now, sir, let us have the truth entire. Who gave you the packet, and what did you expect in return?" The man shook his head violently. "I daren't. You don't know him. If he finds me out, Holmes cut him short with a sudden icy laugh. "Find you out? He already knows you failed. At this very moment he is slinking into the fog, his coat in tatters, swearing your name with every breath. Your only chance lies in making him powerless to strike at you, and that can be done only by placing yourself in our hands fully." The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the station clock. At last, the man licked his lips and spoke. "It was given me by a sailor down at the docks. He said I was to deliver it here, to the man in the grey coat, no questions asked. Paid me 3 sovereigns for the errand. I never opened it, I swear. I thought it might be papers or letters from abroad. That's all I know." "Describe this sailor," Holmes demanded quickly. The fellow squirmed. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar by his mouth. Foreign, maybe. Spoke rough English. Called himself Carl or some such name. Holmes leaned back, satisfied. Enough. For now. Lestrade, secure him at the yard. He is of more value to us alive than at liberty or dead. Reluctantly, Lestrade gave the order for 2 constables to take the man away. As their footsteps faded, Holmes turned his attention to the envelope. With a surgeon's delicacy, he broke the seal. Inside lay a set of folded documents, yellowed and brittle with age, and a small sketch of a device, drawn in sharp, mechanical detail. Watson, though I am no engineer, I could see that the sketch represented some form of detonator, cunningly wrought with a mechanism for delayed ignition. My heart gave a sudden leap of dread. Holmes's eyes flashed as he spread the papers upon his knee. This, gentlemen, is no trivial correspondence. Here we have the design for an infernal machine of considerable ingenuity, and these are, look here, notations in German script, calculations of timing and pressure. Our dead man was no idle traveller. He carried knowledge of deadly significance. Lestrade whistled. So we've stumbled into anarchists' business, have we? By heaven, that would explain it. We've had whisperings for months of a foreign hand stirring trouble in London. If these devils mean to plant their bombs in the city— Holmes silenced him with a gesture. Conjecture will not catch our quarry. What we know is this: the stranger on platform 7 died with a meeting unfulfilled. Another man sought the knowledge he carried, and still another conveyed the link between them. That chain is broken but not destroyed. We hold one link in custody, and another, in grey wool, has slipped into the fog. The question now is whether we can follow the chain to its master before further harm is wrought. He folded the documents once more, slipping them into his inner pocket. His face was stern, his voice low. Watson, Lestrade, tonight's encounter was but the overture. The true drama is yet to come. I shall need all my wits and both your aid to see it through. We left the station as the hour struck 1, the fog still thick upon the city. As we drove back to Baker Street, I could not shake from my mind the vision of the lifeless man upon the bench, nor the cold gleam in Holmes's eyes as he handled the fatal papers. I knew we were embarked upon no ordinary case, but one whose shadows stretched across borders and whose conclusion might touch the very safety of London itself. The cab wheels rattled over the cobblestones, their sound muffled by the heavy fog pressing down upon the city. Holmes sat opposite me in our carriage, his long frame bent slightly forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some point beyond the murky glass. His silence was so profound that even Lestrade, who rode with us, refrained from further questions. For myself, though curiosity gnawed at me, I had long since learned that to press Holmes prematurely was to risk disturbing a mind in its most delicate state of concentration. I waited, content to watch the measured rise and fall of his breath and the faint gleam in his eyes that spoke of deductions rapidly forming. At length, as we turned into Baker Street, Holmes stirred. "Watson," he said, his tone low but precise, "what strikes you as the most peculiar element in tonight's affair?" I considered. The man's sudden death, perhaps, stricken before our very eyes without visible cause, or the involvement of those foreign documents, which would suggest a matter of international consequence. "Both weighty," Holmes replied, "yet not to my mind the crux. Consider instead the sailor, the supposed intermediary, paid to deliver yet clearly ignorant of the value of what he carried. Why employ such a tool unless the true instigator wished his own hands far removed from the transaction? Then you believe the sailor himself to be but another pawn?" "Precisely so, a pawn moved by unseen hands. And pawns, Watson, while often sacrificed, leave behind traces of the player's strategy. It is those traces we must uncover." We alighted before the familiar steps of 221B, where Mrs. Hudson, roused from her rest, fussed about the lateness of the hour. Holmes brushed her concerns aside, ushering us upstairs with uncharacteristic haste. Once in our sitting room, he spread the documents across the table beneath the lamplight, his gaze intent. "These diagrams," he murmured, "bear markings I have encountered before. Note here, this signature HK scrawled at the margin. It is the same cipher I observed in a dossier some years past concerning a German artificer, Heinrich Krauss, known for his work in explosives and timed devices. He vanished from Berlin under suspicion of selling his designs to the highest bidder. If Krauss is indeed in London, then this paper is worth a regiment of men to him, or to his employers. Lestrade frowned. And the dead man on the bench? How does he come into it? Holmes leaned back, fingertips pressed together. That, Inspector, is the most tantalizing question of all. He bore the documents, yet not as their originator. His dress bespoke a man of means, but not of the working class. His hands, Watson, you noticed it too, did you not? The ink stains upon the fingers? Indeed, I answered. I remarked them at once. The marks of one accustomed to pen and ledger. Exactly. A clerk, or a translator perhaps, one who dealt in correspondence, not machinery. Thus he was the courier of knowledge, not its creator. His role was to bridge the gap between the source of these plans and their intended purchaser. He paid for that role with his life. Lestrade tapped the table impatiently. But who would want such stuff in London? We've heard whispers of anarchists, as I said, but whispers don't hang a man. Holmes gave him a keen glance. No anarchist rabble would pay sovereigns to sailors, nor devise such elaborate subterfuge. No, Inspector, we are in the presence of a more disciplined foe. Mark me, before many days are out, the grey-coated gentleman will surface again, and when he does, it shall be in pursuit of these very pages. As if to seal his words, Holmes folded the documents carefully and locked them within his desk drawer. He then rose, pacing the length of the room with swift, nervous strides. There remains, however, the manner of the stranger's death. Sudden collapse, no wound, no struggle. Watson, you examined him closely. Did you perceive aught unusual? I recalled the pallor of the man's skin, the faint bluish tinge upon the lips. It was as if the breath had been stolen from him. Poison, perhaps, though I saw no vial, no dart, nothing. Poison, yes, Holmes agreed, but of a most subtle order. I caught the faintest odor, a bitter almond, fleeting, almost lost in the night air. Cyanide, Watson. A single crystal upon the tongue would suffice, and could be carried hidden in the seam of a glove. Our man either swallowed it by force or by his own hand, though which we must yet discover. Lestrade gave a low whistle. Then he took it, himself rather than betray his master. Possibly. Or perhaps the grey-coated figure in their brief encounter contrived to slip it to him. We lack witnesses to that instant, and therein lies our difficulty. But I promise you, Inspector, we shall have clarity soon enough. The clock on the mantel struck 3. Lestrade departed with a reluctant promise to return at first light. I myself was near overcome with weariness, yet Holmes, with his usual disregard for fatigue, remained bent over his desk, cross-referencing notes and muttering to himself. At last, as I prepared to retire, he raised his head. "Watson," he said softly, "guard your rest tonight, for tomorrow we begin in earnest. There is one man in this city who will know of Krauss, and if fortune favors us, we may yet intercept the next move before it is played." The next morning dawned pale and cold, with the fog lingering stubbornly in the streets. I found Holmes already dressed, his hat and cane at the ready, his eyes bright with suppressed energy. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "We go to the docks. Where sailors whisper, secrets drift like smoke. Our scarred intermediary may not have vanished entirely, and if he has, the memory of him will linger in the taverns he haunts." And so once more we set forth into the labyrinth of London, the weight of the dead man's silence pressing ever heavier upon us, and the shadow of the grey coat looming, unseen but inevitable, just beyond the reach of the morning light. The fog at the docks was heavier than that which shrouded Baker Street, rolling in from the Thames in pale curtains that clung to the warehouses and masts like a ghostly veil. The cries of gulls echoed through the damp morning air, mingling with the creak of rigging and the shouts of stevedores unloading cargo. It was into this grim and bustling scene that Holmes led me, his gaze flitting from face to face with the Chiu. Rapid appraisal of a man accustomed to extracting significance from the smallest details. We threaded our way through the narrow alleys that lay behind the wharves, where taverns and lodging-houses catered to sailors of every nation. Holmes paused before a weather-beaten inn, whose signboard, depicting a faded mermaid, swung lazily in the wind. "The Mermaid's Rest," he murmured, "a fitting haunt for our scarred intermediary. Come, Watson, let us see what the tide has washed ashore." Inside, the tavern was dimly lit, the air thick with the fumes of tobacco and spilled. Thal. Rough men sat hunched over their tankards, their faces etched with the hardships of the sea. Holmes moved among them with an ease that belied his usual aloofness, pausing at one table to examine a scrap of rope, at another to glance at the tattoos upon a sailor's arm. Each observation was filed away, though he made no comment. At last, he approached the bar, where a burly landlord was polishing glasses with a rag that seemed to spread rather than remove the dirt. "A glass of porter," Holmes said pleasantly, tossing a coin upon the counter. "And perhaps some information. A man, scar across his jaw, sailor's gait, frequenting this establishment within the last week?" The landlord eyed him suspiciously, then pocketed the coin. "Aye, I've seen the one you speak of. Rough fellow, kept to himself mostly. Went. By the name of Blake, or so he claimed. He was here 3 nights past, drinking heavier than was his custom. Left with a stranger, well-dressed, grey coat. I mind it because such company was unusual for the likes of him." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. And did he return after that evening?" The landlord shook his head. "Not that I've seen, nor any word of him since." Holmes thanked the man with a nod and withdrew to a corner table, beckoning me to follow. His expression was alight with the thrill of discovery. "Watson, do you not perceive how neatly the threads entwine? The scarred sailor, our intermediary, last seen departing with none other than the grey-coated figure." The chain tightens. Before I could reply, a commotion erupted at the far end of the tavern. 2 sailors grappled fiercely, overturning chairs and scattering mugs. Holmes rose swiftly, his eyes narrowing. "Not a quarrel, Watson, observe. The larger man seeks only to hold the other, not strike. See, the smaller fellow is desperate to flee. We pushed through the throng just as the—" Smaller sailor, wild-eyed, cried out, "Let me go, I'll not speak of it again, I swear it." Holmes stepped forward with quiet authority, and the sailors, startled by his presence, slackened their struggle. "My good fellow," Holmes said gently, "you have no need to fear. We seek only knowledge, not harm. Was it Blake of whom you spoke?" The sailor's face blanched, and he made the sign of the cross upon his chest. "Blake, aye, but he's gone to the depths now, and I'll not follow him. They said he carried something cursed, and the man in the grey coat—" He broke off, glancing about in terror. Holmes placed a reassuring hand upon his arm. "Calm yourself. Speak freely. Your words may serve justice for a man wronged." The sailor licked his lips. Blake boasted he had a cargo worth more than gold, though he scarce knew its worth himself. He was to deliver it, but he grew uneasy, said he'd been followed. Then, that night, the gentleman in the grey coat came for him. They left together. Blake was never seen again. And last evening, word spread that another, an educated-looking sort, had been found dead at the station, the same cargo in his keeping. That is why I'll not speak further. There's death in it." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Death, perhaps, but also a design most deliberate. You have done well to speak so much, and you may rest assured your silence hereafter will not shield you from the fate of others, but my intervention may. Keep clear of strangers in grey coats, and you shall fare better than your companion." The man nodded fearfully and slipped away. Holmes turned to me, his eyes glittering with that cold fire which always heralded the nearness of revelation. "Watson, we have confirmation. The grey coat disposes of those who serve his purpose, whether sailor or clerk. Blake vanished. The stranger on the platform perished, both bound by these infernal papers. What does that suggest?" "That the grey coat intends to remove all traces of the chain, leaving himself alone in possession of the knowledge," I ventured. "Just so. Our man who fears exposure. A man of resources, cunning, and I dare say official standing." Holmes's lips curved in a grim smile. "This is no anarchist, Watson. This is a hand that plays in deeper waters, political waters. I suspect we shall soon feel the current ourselves." He rose abruptly. "Come, we have gleaned all we can here. The next move must be ours. There is an office in Whitehall, discreet, yet indispensable. where news of foreign agents finds its way. It is thither. We go. But mark me, Watson. The grey coat knows we are upon his trail, and before this game is done, he will not scruple to strike at us directly. With that foreboding pronouncement, Holmes swept from the tavern into the clammy morning air, and I, my heart quickened by the danger he foretold, followed him into the fog, where every shadow seemed to conceal the gaze of an unseen watcher. Fog thickened as we left the riverside quarter and hailed a hansom for Whitehall. Holmes gave the driver curt instructions and then fell into one of his profound silences, his chin upon his chest, his long fingers drumming against the handle of his cane. I refrained from breaking in, for I knew that silence was to Holmes what the scalpel was to a surgeon, a necessary instrument with which he laid bare the heart of a mystery. Only once did he speak, in a tone so low I scarce caught the words. "A pattern, Watson. Always a pattern. Once discerned, the whole fabric will unravel." The cab rattled through the misty streets until we reached the government quarter. Our destination, as Holmes had intimated, was not one of the grand offices, but rather an inconspicuous building tucked into a narrow lane. To the casual eye, it might have been a solicitor's practice or a minor registry. In truth, it was a node in the great web of British intelligence. Holmes, whose acquaintance extended into all manner of unlikely circles, was admitted without question, and I followed him into a stark chamber where a single lamp cast a pale glow upon sheaves of reports and maps pinned to the walls. A thin, hawk-nosed man rose to greet us. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a stiffness that betrayed military training, "we had word you might come." Holmes inclined his head. "Colonel Ashcroft, if I mistake not, we are upon the trail of a document, plans of German origin, devices, of a destructive nature. I believe your office has had cause to note the movements of one Heinrich Kraus." Ashcroft's brows contracted. "Kraus is a dangerous rogue. He traffics in invention as others in contraband, caring nothing for whom his designs serve. He was last reported in Antwerp, but rumours place him now in London. Our fear is that his work may find its way into the hands of agitators, or worse, rival powers." Holmes seated himself and steepled his fingers. "Then permit me to allay one part of your concern. The papers are here in London, and 2 men who touched them have perished. Both were intermediaries, not originators. Both last seen in the company of a certain gentleman in a grey coat." Ashcroft's eyes sharpened. "Grey coat, you say? That accords ill with whispers we've had of a foreign agent moving under such guise. A man with many aliases, but known to us as Kranz. He works not for anarchists, but for a continental power. A cautious operator, never leaves witnesses, never handles the goods until all others are cleared from his path." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then we hunt the same quarry. Kranz has shown his hand. The sailor is gone, the clerk is dead, yet the prize remains out of his grasp, for the documents are secured." He tapped his breast pocket, though I knew the bundle rested safely at Baker Street. "He will strike again, Colonel. Of that we may be certain." Ashcroft's lips pressed to a line. "Then strike first, Mr. Holmes. Set your trap and we will lend what aid we can." Holmes rose at once, his energy rekindled. "No, Colonel. Too many hands spoil the craft. This net must be drawn with delicacy. Watson and I shall play our part. Your men must wait until the fish is fairly in it. One misstep and Kranz will vanish as smoke before the wind." A brief, tense silence followed. Then Ashcroft inclined his head. "Very well, but know this. If you fail, the consequences may reach far beyond a London platform." Outside, the air seemed colder still. Holmes drew me close as we walked. "You perceive, Watson, how the noose tightens. Kranz hunts the papers, unaware that we already anticipate his every move, yet one piece remains missing. How did the stranger on the platform come into possession of them? Until we answer that, our trap lacks bait." As if in answer, fate intervened. A messenger approached at that instant, breathless from haste. He bore a note for Holmes, scrawled in a hurried hand. Holmes opened it, scanned the contents, and his eyes glittered. "Ah, our mystery clerk had lodgings near Bloomsbury. His landlady reports that his rooms were rifled in the night, papers scattered, desk forced, though nothing taken. She begs immediate assistance." "Then Kranz has already made his move," I exclaimed. "Not quite," said Holmes, quickening his pace. "If he had found what he sought, the landlady would not be alive to send word. No, Watson, he searched, but too late. Come, Bloomsbury awaits. Bloomsbury awaits. We arrived at a modest townhouse, where the anxious landlady wrung her hands at the sight of us. She led us up narrow stairs to a room in disarray. Drawers pulled open, sheets tossed aside, the faint smell of tobacco smoke lingering. Holmes moved swiftly, examining the scattered papers, pausing at an overturned chair, then kneeling to inspect a mark upon the carpet. "Observe, Watson," he said. The chair was not overturned in struggle, but placed thus to mask a scuff upon the floor. And here, the ash of a cigar, dark and pungent, of a brand sold only at one shop in the Strand. Krantz is careful, but even he leaves crumbs for those with eyes to see. Holmes straightened, his gaze distant, yet burning with calculation. "We are close, Watson, very close. Tonight the grey coat will seek again, and this time we shall be ready." As we stepped back into the fog-drenched street, I felt a shiver not wholly due to the chill, for I knew that the game Holmes spoke of was one of life and death, and that the hunter we pursued might well turn his sights upon us before the night was done. Holmes walked at a brisk pace as we left Bloomsbury, his coat swirling about his lean frame, his cane striking the pavement with purposeful rhythm. I could tell that his mind was moving faster than his steps, for he spoke little, his gaze fixed ahead, though he saw nothing of the lamplit streets. At last, when I could contain my curiosity no longer, I ventured, "Holmes, what course do you intend? You spoke of being ready, yet ready in what sense?" He glanced at me, the ghost of a smile at his lips. "Patience, Watson. A trap must be baited before it can be sprung. Krantz believes the papers still in circulation, for why else would he ransack the lodgings? He does not know that they lie secure in Baker Street. Tonight we shall dangle a lure that no cautious predator can resist. And what form will this lure take?" Holmes drew his cloak tighter as a gust of wind scattered the fog about us. "A meeting, Watson. A discreet transaction," whispered, "in the right quarter, with the promise that the papers are to change hands once more. Krantz will hear of it. He must, for his network is efficient, and when he comes to intercept, he shall find not a helpless clerk nor a hapless sailor, but Sherlock Holmes." I could not repress a shiver. "And myself?" Holmes's eyes softened for a brief instant. "You, my dear fellow, will be where you always are, at my side. But take heart. I have no intention of allowing our adversary the satisfaction of an open confrontation. We shall use his own caution against him." True to his word, Holmes set his scheme in motion with astonishing swiftness. That very afternoon he visited a dingy coffee-house near the Strand, a place where messengers, minor clerks, and the shadowy figures who haunted London's underbelly mingled freely. There, with the casual ease of a man speaking of trifles, he let fall a rumour into eager ears that a certain packet of German origin, much coveted, would be exchanged at Charing Cross station at the stroke of midnight. The listener, a sharp-eyed fellow with the look of a runner for less than reputable employers, needed little encouragement to carry the tale onwards. Holmes left him to it, confident that within hours the bait would reach Krantz. Night fell heavy over the city, the fog thickening once more so that the lamps glowed like halos in the murk. Holmes and I took our places well before the appointed hour. He had chosen a vantage point at the far end of Platform 7, where the shadow of an overhanging roof concealed us from all but the closest scrutiny. The station was quieter than I had expected. A few late travellers hurried about, their forms half vanished in the mist, and the occasional rumble of a departing train echoed like distant thunder. Holmes crouched beside a stack of luggage, his keen eyes fixed upon the concourse. "He will come," he whispered. "Men like Krantz cannot abide the thought of loose threads. He has cut off the sailor and the clerk, and now he believes the final strand lies within his grasp. Tonight will show whether the hunter or the hunted is more cunning." Minutes dragged with agonizing slowness. I fancied I could hear the pounding of my own heart, and once or twice I caught myself starting at shadows that proved to be no more than porters wheeling trolleys. Then Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. "There," he breathed. Through the shifting fog a tall figure emerged from the main entrance. His coat, long and grey, hung heavy about him, and a soft felt hat was drawn low to obscure his features. He moved with the calm assurance of one who knows his ground, yet fears exposure. His steps measured, his head turning ever so slightly, as though to take account of every passer-by. Kranz. He came to the appointed place, a bench not far from where we concealed ourselves. For a few tense moments he stood still, surveying the platform, his gloved hands folded before him. Then, as if satisfied, he seated himself and drew from his pocket a watch, consulting it with deliberate care. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Observe, Watson. He is punctual to the minute. A man of discipline. Yet see how he sits, back to the wall, field of vision wide, every exit within sight. A predator indeed," I whispered. "What now? Do we reveal ourselves?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. Let him stew. He expects a messenger. When none appears, he will grow restless. Then, and only then, do we strike." The minutes stretched into a quarter hour. Kranz's composure began to fray. He shifted, consulted his watch again, and cast sharper glances into the gloom. At last he rose, evidently preparing to withdraw. Holmes stepped forward, his figure emerging from the shadow like a conjured spirit. "A pleasant evening, Herr Kranz," he said coolly. The man stiffened, his hand darting instinctively toward his coat. But Holmes's voice, sharp as a blade, forestalled him. "Pray do not attempt it. You will find Scotland Yard has a keen interest in the weight of your pockets tonight." From the opposite end of the platform, Lestrade appeared with 2 plainclothes, officers moving swiftly to block the exits. For once, Holmes had accepted official assistance, though he had kept the timing close to his chest even from me. Kranz's eyes darted from one face to another. For an instant I thought he might attempt flight. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he raised his hands in surrender. "Gentlemen," he said in perfect English, his accent barely perceptible, "you seem to have the advantage." Holmes's gaze was icy. "Only for the moment. Rest assured, Herr Kranz, we shall not permit London to serve as the stage for your intrigues. Your game ends here." Yet even as Lestrade's men moved in, I could not shake a sense of unease. Kranz's smile lingered, calm and enigmatic, as though he knew some hidden truth that eluded us all. And when he finally spoke again, it was with a cryptic assurance that chilled me. "You may have caught me, Mr. Holmes," he murmured, "but the play is larger than one man. Others move still upon the board, and when they do, you will find that Platform 7 was but the beginning." His words hung in the fog as the irons closed upon his wrists, and I felt, even in the moment of triumph, that the mystery had not yet yielded its deepest secret. As Kranz was led away between the plainclothesmen, his cryptic words continued to echo in my mind. The fog seemed thicker in their wake, as though the very air conspired to swallow clarity. Holmes, however, was not a man to let riddles linger untested. He stood perfectly still until Kranz's figure had vanished from the platform, then turned abruptly, his eyes gleaming with a light that bespoke not triumph, but renewed determination. "You heard him, Watson," he said in a low tone. "Others, move still upon the board. It is the note of a man who does not fear imprisonment, but who delights in reminding us that his capture is but one stroke in a larger contest." I frowned. "Do you believe him? Could it not be mere bravado, an attempt to unsettle you? Holmes shook his head slowly. "Kranz is many things, but he is not careless with words. When such a man speaks in riddles, it is because the riddle itself is true. No, Watson, we have checked but one piece, and the game continues unseen. We walked together from the station, Lestrade following close behind." He was clearly elated, rubbing his hands as though victory already belonged to Scotland Yard. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I must say this has been neatly wrapped up. Foreign agents, stolen papers, and the very fellow at the center of it all now in irons. The Yard will be grateful for your assistance, though I suppose you will claim the glory belongs to deduction." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Inspector, I would not uncork your champagne just yet. You may indeed have your man, but not the truth. Kranz has played his part ably, but the orchestration lies elsewhere. I fear we have but the conductor's shadow, not the conductor himself," Lestrade snorted. "You always see shadows where there are none. Still, I'll keep the fellow safe in a cell till you've sorted your doubts." With that he departed, leaving Holmes and myself to the silent streets. As we hailed a cab, I ventured, "Where do we go now?" "To Baker Street." Holmes settled, back against the seat, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "For now, yes, but not to rest. The capture of Kranz has accelerated matters, Watson. Whoever directs him will not waste time. We must anticipate the next move before it is made." The journey back seemed consumed by Holmes's silence. Only the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the occasional cry of a costermonger punctuated the night. When at last we reached Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He lit the lamps, drew out his collection of reference books and dossiers, and spread the clerk's torn notes across the table. "Observe," he said, drawing one fragment close beneath the light. "This portion here, these figures, did you note their pattern? At first glance, mere digits, but they correspond not to sums but to dates, specifically the 3rd and 14th of this month." I bent closer. "The 3rd has passed, but the 14th, that is 3 days hence." "Precisely. And now consider Kranz's cryptic remark, 'Others still move.' What if his work was to prepare the stage for an event scheduled on that date? The murders of the sailor and clerk may not have been ends in themselves, but necessary measures to silence leaks before the play begins in earnest." The possibility chilled me. "Then London itself," Holmes raised a hand. "Let us not indulge in terror before fact, but yes, the possibility exists that an act of grave consequence is intended. The question is, where?" For hours he toiled, consulting maps, decoding scraps of the sailor's torn letter, cross-referencing with his formidable memory of foreign agents and their methods. I sat by, watching the fire burn low, until at last Holmes sprang to his feet, with that sudden electric energy that marked the culmination of his thought. "Watson, I have it. The figures 14 refer not merely to a date, but to a platform. Recall the sailor's note, 'South goods safe.' Combine that with Kranz's choice of Charing Cross, and it becomes evident. The 14th day, the southbound line, and a consignment of goods marked safe. We are not looking at a mere exchange of papers, but at the passage of something or someone through the railway itself." I stared. A smuggled weapon, another agent? Perhaps both. But it is the method that matters. They intend to use the arteries of London, its very lifeblood, as the channel of their design. Unless we intercept it, the consequences may ripple far beyond our city. The firelight cast strange shadows upon his sharp features, accentuating the intensity of his expression. He leaned close, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "We have 3 days, Watson. 3 days to discover the true nature of this plot, to untangle the web that still binds us. Kranz may sleep behind iron bars, but his master walks free. And unless we strike with precision, the 14th will dawn with London awakening to a calamity of international scope." I felt the weight of his words settle upon me, heavy as the fog outside. The chase was far from over. Indeed, it had only deepened. Holmes began to gather his papers with furious energy, already dictating telegrams to allies, compiling lists of names and places that might hold the missing threads. As I sharpened my pen and prepared to assist him, I could not help but glance at the darkened window, where the city beyond slumbered in ignorance of the storm building against it, and in that moment I knew with certainty that the days ahead would test not only Holmes's genius, but our very endurance. For we were no longer chasing shadows, we were racing against time itself. Holmes worked with the ceaseless intensity of a man who knows the smallest delay may prove catastrophic. For my part, I aided where I could, scribbling telegrams to obscure correspondents, fetching volumes from his well-worn library, and watching as his thin fingers flew over the fragments of evidence as though each were a chess piece waiting to be moved into position. By dawn the following day, his eyes gleamed with that unmistakable fire which bespoke both exhaustion and triumph. He rose abruptly, his dressing gown hanging about him like a cloak of victory. "Watson, it becomes ever clearer. The 14th is not merely a date of action, but the fulcrum of a most intricate design. Our task is to discern its locus. For that we must step beyond conjecture and into the field." I could not help but protest. "Holmes, you have scarcely closed your eyes these past 24 hours. If we are to face something of such magnitude, should you not rest? He smiled, faintly, that tight, humorless smile of his. Rest, my dear Watson, is the indulgence of men who have the luxury of time. Time is precisely what we are denied. Come, we must pay a call on Scotland Yard. I have need of both Lestrade's official authority and his unofficial obliviousness. At the Yard, we found Lestrade already flushed with self-congratulation. The morning's papers blazed with headlines. Of Crans's capture, the inspector's name emblazoned beside words like masterstroke and brilliant detection. He greeted us with hearty satisfaction, though Holmes received his praise with his customary froideur. "Your German bird sings not at all, I suppose?" Holmes asked coolly. "Not a note," Lestrade admitted, though his grin did not falter. "Tight-lipped fellow, that one. Still, no matter, we've got him secured, and his silence only damns him further." Holmes tapped a finger against his lip. "So you believe. Yet I tell you, Inspector, Crans is but a cipher. The key remains at large, and it is that key which may yet unlock calamity. I require full access to your prisoner, as well as any documents seized from his person." Lestrade frowned, but perhaps suspecting that Holmes's disdain concealed some indispensable purpose, he relented. We were soon ushered into a stark chamber where Crans sat, hands clasped, his expression one of calm amusement. His dark eyes glinted. As Holmes entered, as though the mere sight of him afforded some private satisfaction, Holmes wasted no courtesy. "Herr Krantz, you spoke of others moving upon the board. Tell me, what role have you played? Is it pawn, knight, or bishop?" the say. Prisoner's lips curled faintly. "I play the part I am given, Herr Holmes, but even a pawn may bring a king to ruin if moved at the right moment." Holmes leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "The 14th, then. What is its meaning?" Crans tilted his head. "You see patterns where there may be none. Perhaps the numbers speak only of dates and trains. Perhaps you seek complexity where only simplicity lies." With a sudden gesture, Holmes seized the man's wrist, forcing his hand into the light. Upon the skin, barely visible, was the faint trace of ink, a stamped mark in German characters, though blurred with sweat. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A freight manifest," he murmured. "So you have indeed prepared a consignment?" Crans smiled. "Prepared? Perhaps. But whether it arrives or not, that is no longer my burden. My part is ended." Holmes released him, stepping back with a look of grim satisfaction. "Thank you, Herr Krantz. You have told me all I needed." Outside in the corridor, Lestrade demanded, "Well, what did you see in that nonsense?" Holmes turned sharply, the light of certainty flashing in his eyes. "Ink upon the wrist, Inspector. No idle scrawl, but the residue of a consignment stamp used upon freight manifests. Our man is tied not only to men, but to goods. It confirms my hypothesis. The 14th is not an abstract signal, but the date of a shipment that will move through our very rails beneath the feet of London." We left the Yard in haste, Holmes already issuing instructions. He dispatched telegrams to railway officials, demanding access to freight records and scribbled notes, to contacts in the Foreign Office. By afternoon we had sequestered ourselves in a drafty office at Charing Cross, poring over ledgers and schedules with a harried clerk. At first the columns blurred together. Tons of coal, crates of textiles, shipments of machinery bound southward. But Holmes's hand moved unerringly, tracing down the pages until it halted upon an entry marked with unusual vagueness. Consignment, safe, priority clearance, destination, Dover. Holmes tapped the page. "There it is, Watson. The word safe. The very one from the sailor's note. Dover, of course, being the throat through which England meets the continent. Something is to pass there on the 14th, and it has been given special clearance, free from the usual inspections. I leaned closer, a shiver running through me. But what could it be? Arms? Documents? An assassin smuggled like common freight? Possibly all three, Holmes said gravely. That is the genius of their design. The vagueness conceals the very danger. Whatever lies within that consignment, it must be intercepted before it leaves English soil. We have found the artery, Watson. Now we must staunch it. The clerk blinked nervously. But gentlemen, this This consignment has official seals. To interfere would require extraordinary authority. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then extraordinary authority we shall have. Watson, tomorrow we go to Whitehall. There are men there who will balk at my impertinence, but when I lay the pieces before them, they will have no choice but to grant us the power to act. 3 days remain, and every hour counts. As we left the station, the city bustled around, thus oblivious to the quiet war waged beneath its cobblestones and timetables. Holmes walked swiftly, his head bent in thought, his coat flaring in the autumn wind. I kept pace at his side, my heart heavy with the knowledge that we pursued not merely a murderer, but a design vast enough to imperil nations. And as the shadows lengthened across the river, Holmes spoke almost to himself, his words chilling in their certainty. It is no longer a question of who, Watson, but of when and where. The 14th shall answer us soon enough. Until then, we must be ready to meet it. The following morning found us rattling along in a hansom cab bound for Whitehall. Holmes's features sharpened by that peculiar light of concentrated purpose which so often signalled the climax of a case. He spoke little, save to mutter fragments of calculations under his breath or jot an occasional note in his pocketbook. I knew better than to interrupt him, though my mind teemed with questions. The enormity of what lay before us weighed heavily on me, a plot threaded through the veins of London's railways, with the 14th looming ever nearer. At the Foreign Office we were ushered into a chamber hung with dark oak and heavy curtains, where a small assembly of civil servants awaited us. Their faces bore the faint look of irritation common to bureaucrats who feel their time is being intruded upon. Holmes, however, swept into their midst with the confidence of a general briefing his staff before a campaign. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "what I lay before you is no trivial affair of petty espionage. The man Crans, whom Scotland Yard congratulates itself upon capturing, is but a herald. His true service lay in preparing the ground for a consignment scheduled to leave Dover on the 14th. Within that consignment lies the means of undermining not merely the safety of this capital, but the stability of our alliances abroad. If unchecked, it may precipitate a crisis of European scale." The officials exchanged doubtful glances. One, a narrow-chested man with a clipped moustache, spoke first. "Mr. Holmes, you offer assertions without proof. To detain a consignment marked with official seals would be a grave overreach. Do you have evidence to justify such interference?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Evidence, sir, is the backbone of my profession. The sailor who perished upon Platform 7 bore a note marked, 'South Goods Safe.' Crans bore upon his wrist the stamp of a freight manifest. And in the records at Charing Cross, we discovered a vague consignment, granted priority clearance marked only with that same word, 'Safe,' bound for Dover on the 14th. Taken singly, mere curiosities. Taken together, they form a pattern. More precise than any signature, the room fell into uneasy silence. At last the senior official, a heavy-set man with a resonant voice, inclined his head. "Mr. Holmes, your reputation precedes you, and though I find your methods unconventional, I cannot deny the logic of your chain. Very well, you shall have authority to examine this consignment, but discretion is imperative. Should this prove a phantom, Whitehall will not shield you from the ridicule of press or Parliament." Holmes bowed slightly. "I ask for no shield, only the freedom to act." We left with the precious authorization in hand, Holmes tucking the document into his breast pocket with a satisfied air. "Watson," he said as we descended the steps, "we have the key. Now we must be at the lock before the thief turns it. To Dover we go." The journey south consumed most of the day. The countryside blurred past in greys and greens, while Holmes remained silent, his long fingers drumming against the carriage's wooden ledge. I confess that fatigue weighed upon me, yet Holmes seemed animated by some inner fire that rendered sleep superfluous. When at last the train drew into Dover, the salt air and cries of gulls greeted us like a herald of the sea itself. Holmes wasted no time in presenting our documents to the station master, who blinked at the impressive signatures before bowing. Fast through to the freight yards. The place bustled with activity, crates and barrels piled high, wagons drawn by sweating horses, dockworkers shouting over the clang of iron rails. Yet amidst this ordered chaos, Holmes' eyes moved with hawk-like precision. "There," he said at length, pointing to a line of sealed crates marked with indistinct symbols. "Observe the paint, Watson, newer than the wood it covers, and the seals, official yet applied with a haste that betrays the hand of forgery. This is no honest cargo." We moved closer. Holmes knelt, brushing dust from the side of a crate. The word "safe," painted in faint chalk, the sailor's dying clue confirmed. Before I could respond, a sudden movement caught my eye. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, loitered near the crates, his gaze fixed upon us with unmistakable intensity. When Holmes rose to his full height and met that gaze, the man turned abruptly and vanished into the crowd. Holmes seized my arm. "Quickly, Watson, after him." We plunged into the throng, jostling dock workers and slipping between carts. The man moved with surprising agility for his size, weaving through narrow passages until we burst into a lane. That led toward the sea. For a moment we had him in sight, his dark coat flaring in the wind, but as we rounded a corner he was gone. Holmes halted, breathing hard, his eyes scanning every shadow. Clever, very clever. He wished to see who watched the crates, then to vanish like smoke, yet even smoke betrays the fire beneath. Returning to the freight yard, we found the suspicious crates untouched, guarded now by Lestrade, who had arrived on a later train at Holmes's urgent request. The inspector looked flustered but determined. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I've done as you asked. What's in these boxes then? Dynamite? Secret papers?" Holmes's gaze lingered on the crates, his expression unreadable. "That, Inspector, is the question upon which the safety of London may turn. But we shall not open them yet. The enemy watches still, and to act rashly may drive them to desperate measures. No, better to let them believe their scheme proceeds undisturbed until the final moment when we close the net." Lestrade muttered under his breath, but acquiesced. I, however, could not suppress a shiver as I looked at the sealed crates, their silent menace seeming to pulse in the gathering dusk. Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder. "Steady, Watson. The 14th draws near, and with it the heart of this conspiracy. Tonight we watch, we listen, and we wait. The board is nearly set, and the next move will reveal the true master of the game." As night fell over Dover, the yard settled into uneasy quiet. Lamps flickered against the sea mist and shadows deepened around the ominous cargo. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes watched us even as we kept our vigil. And beside me, Holmes stood motionless, his profile sharp against the lamplight as though carved from iron, his mind already one step ahead in the perilous contest that would the night at Dover passed in tense silence, broken only by the rattle of chains and the distant wash of the tide against the harbour wall. Holmes stood as still as a sentinel, his gaze fixed upon the row of suspicious crates, while Lestrade shifted uneasily from foot to foot. I confess that fatigue and a peculiar dread weighed upon me, and more than once I started at the mere creak of a wagon or the distant hoot of a ship's horn. At last, as the bells tolled midnight, movement stirred at the edge of the yard. A group of men approached, dockhands by their dress, though Holmes's sharp glance told me all I needed to know. Their steps were too careful, their voices too hushed, their eyes too often darting towards the very cargo we watched. "Patience, Watson," Holmes murmured as I felt my muscles tense. "We must let them play their hand." The men set to work swiftly, prizing open one of the crates with iron tools. The wood splintered under their efforts, and when the lid came free, I beheld, not the mundane goods of commerce, but long cylinders, wrapped in oiled cloth, each stenciled with foreign characters. Even my untrained eye recognized them at once. Explosives. Lestrade could restrain himself no longer. With a shout, he and his men surged forward. A brief struggle ensued. The dockhands fought with desperate ferocity, but they were no match for the prepared officers. Within minutes they lay in irons, cursing in guttural accents. Holmes stepped calmly to the opened crate, drawing back the cloth from one of the cylinders. "Nitroglycerin-based charges," he said coolly. "Enough, I should estimate, to reduce half of Charing Cross Station to rubble. A tidy method of sowing terror, and with it a convenient pretext for certain foreign powers to test the mettle of our alliances. You see, Watson, Had this shipment passed unchecked, it would have been planted where its detonation would cause both maximum destruction and maximum political consequence. I shuddered. And the sailor, the clerk. They were silenced because they had stumbled upon this plot? Precisely. The sailor carried word of what he had unwittingly transported. The clerk pieced together fragments from coded notes. Krantz removed them both, but too late to prevent suspicion. That suspicion reached me, and thus the scheme unraveled. One of the captured men spat upon the ground. "You think you have one Englishman?" Krantz was right. Others still move. The game does not end here. Holmes regarded him with cold detachment. Games end when the board is cleared. And tonight I believe your side has lost its queen. The explosives were seized under heavy guard, and by dawn, the conspirators were bound for London, Lestrade beaming with the pride of a man whose name would soon be splashed across the papers once again. Yet as we sat in the train back to the capital, I saw none of that satisfaction in Holmes's features. He stared out into the passing countryside, his expression grave. "Does it trouble you," I asked at last, "that the man Krantz spoke truth, that others remain?" Holmes sighed softly. "It is the nature of such struggles, Watson. The Hydra grows new heads as fast as one may cut them, yet each plot foiled buys time, time for vigilance, time for reason to prevail over chaos. That is all one man may hope to achieve." When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes threw himself into his armchair, lighting his pipe with the air of one who has spent the last of his energy. I could not resist expressing my admiration. "Holmes, you have once again saved London from a calamity none could have foreseen. Your foresight and logic astound me." He waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense, my dear Watson. I have done no more than follow the trail where it led. The rest was merely patience and observation. Yet I knew, as I wrote these words in my notes that evening, that without Holmes's singular genius, the 14th would have dawned not upon a peaceful London, but upon ruin and terror. The crates at Dover would have travelled unchallenged, the bombs within them unleashed upon unsuspecting thousands. And so, though he disdained praise, I could not help but feel an abiding reverence for the man who, with nothing more than his keen eye and sharper mind, had once again stood between our fragile civilization and the abyss. Holmes leaned back, exhaling a thin ribbon of smoke, his eyes half closed. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "the world is but a great game of chess. Men like Krantz move their pieces with cunning, but so long as reason remains vigilant, there will always be a counter-move. Let us hope for the world's sake that reason does not grow weary." And with that he lapsed into silence while the fog pressed once more against the windows of Baker Street, as though determined to conceal the perils and intrigues that lurked beyond, perils that for this night at least had been vanquished.